My name is Logan Sanders with Sanders Retirement Planning. If you haven't heard, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act passed earlier this year, and it brought about a number of tax changes. In the end, these could end up saving you thousands of dollars, and so we wanted to highlight a few of the important changes that we've seen and how we're seeing them impact a lot of our clients' tax situations. The first big change is that there's a new enhanced deduction that could be available to senior citizens. This one isn't going to apply for everyone, and so it's important to understand what the requirements are and if this may be able to help you in your tax situation this year. So first thing to know with this is that the deduction itself could remove up to $6,000 per person on your tax return. And so that deduction, that certainly helps. If we're in the 22% tax bracket, for example, a $6,000 deduction, that's going to save us a little over $1,000. So it is important to pay attention to this and understand if you're going to be eligible. Now, with that being said, what are the requirements? So number one is you have to be a senior citizen. How that's defined right now is if you're age 65 or older at the end of the tax year, you're old enough to qualify for this new enhanced deduction. So that's step number one. The other thing I'd like to mention with this is that deductions, a lot of times we'll hear that and think, I take the standard deduction. I don't itemize. Am I going to be eligible for this? And the answer is yes. It doesn't matter whether you're taking the standard deduction or itemized deduction. This is a separate new category of deductions. And so the itemization of your deductions does not matter. The other thing, though, that could matter here is that there are income limits that apply. And so to give you an example, if you are an individual tax filer and you have $75,000 or less of a modified adjusted gross income, at that point you should qualify for the full $6,000 deduction. Now, beyond $75,000 and going up through $175,000, there is a phase out, which means that as you have more income within that range, this deduction is going to get smaller and smaller until you reach $175,000 of income as an individual filer, and then at that point, the deduction is no more. For a couple married filing jointly, their range is similar, but it's a little bit higher. So their income can go all the way up to $150,000 without any deduction or reduction in this deduction here, and then it continues to get smaller and smaller as their income would increase from $150,000 up through $250,000, and then beyond $250,000 of adjusted gross income, then the deduction is no more for them. One other thing to be aware of is that as of right now, this is scheduled to be in place for a limited time period. So it's going to start in 2025 for the 2025 tax year here. It'll continue for 2026, 2027, and 2028 as it's written right now. It could certainly be extended beyond that at that time, but as of today, we're planning that it will only be around for these next 4 years and want to make sure that we're planning accordingly. Change number two has to do with the actual tax rates or tax brackets themselves. So since the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed back in 2017 and then applying for the 2018 tax year and forward, we've had a little bit lower tax brackets or tax rates than what was in place prior to that. And in 2026, those tax rates were scheduled to go back up to their previous levels. Well, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that removed that change and instead kept the tax brackets that we've had over the past several years in place going forward indefinitely. And so it's not going to feel like a big change for you starting in 2026. It should just kind of remain status quo. There's other changes that will impact you as we're discussing, but that one in particular, not going to feel like a big change in the moment, but it is a bigger change as far as planning considerations go. When we look into the future, before we could see that tax rates were scheduled to go up, and so we may have wanted to pull income forward intentionally to try to beat that increase that was scheduled in the tax rates. That situation no longer applies. It certainly could be the case that tax rates increase at some point in the future. That's always something to be mindful of, but as of today, there's no imminent increase on the horizon. And so that's a big change to be aware of going forward. The third big change is that the cap on the state and local tax deduction has been increased all the way from $10,000 up to $40,000. And so that $40,000, that new cap, is going to be applicable whether you're a single tax filer or married filing jointly. If you are married filing separately, at that point it gets cut in half down to $20,000. Otherwise, $40,000 cap across the board. Now, taking a step back, what are state and local taxes that typically apply? So biggest ones we typically see, large property taxes, that's a big one. And then the other one is either state income taxes or sales tax. You got to pick one of the two. Most of the time we see income tax being higher, but that's not always the case. So $40,000 cap. The thing to know with this, though, is that it really only applies if you itemize your deductions rather than taking the standard deduction. Quick note on the standard deduction, that has also increased slightly as part of this new tax law, which means that even more people will likely be taking the standard deduction instead of itemizing. But if you do itemize, and if you're not sure if you do, some common situations where it might make sense to look into this: if you still have a mortgage and are paying high mortgage interest, if you have high property tax or state income tax, if you have given large charitable gifts, that could be a good reason to look into it. Or if you have a large number of medical expenses which aren't reimbursed. And so those are situations we typically see. A lot of times it's a combination of multiple of those categories where the itemized deduction, the sum of those, becomes larger than the standard deduction, and then it makes more sense to itemize. So it's only going to apply if you're in that itemized deduction camp. The other thing to know is that it's not available at any income level. So the income level on this one, the phase out, is quite a bit higher. Again, this is the same phase out whether you're married filing jointly or single. And so for this one, you can take the full $40,000 deduction all the way up through $500,000 of modified adjusted gross income. And then the phase out range, it's pretty tight considering the level. It's $100,000 where once you get up to $600,000 of income and beyond, your cap on your state and local tax deduction is going to be dropped back down to that $10,000 level that it was before this change. And so that income range, again, not going to apply to a ton of people, but if you're in that situation where your income may be within that phase out range, you need to understand where you're at and determine, is there income you can either delay back a few years maybe to take advantage of this deduction while it's around, or is there a way that you can maybe realize all of the income in 1 year? That's for you to review with your personal situation. I want you to be aware of that. There may be opportunities to try to optimize this deduction over time. Those are three of the bigger changes that we saw with the new tax law being implemented, but I wanted to leave you with one more additional bonus change to be aware of looking ahead. And this one's going to be for non-itemizers in particular. So if you take the standard deduction starting next year, tax year 2026. And if you weren't aware, if you've been taking the standard deduction, charitable donations over the past several years haven't been reducing your taxable income unless you were doing it through a qualified charitable distribution, which is something I'll touch on in a second. But starting in 2026, as long as the donations to a qualified public charity, whether it be your church or another qualified charitable organization, you could be able to deduct a little bit from your taxes going forward. So if you're a single filer, you could deduct up to $1,000 of income for your charitable donations starting next year. And if you're married filing jointly, you may be able to deduct up to $2,000. And so this can be a good alternative if you're not using qualified charitable distributions. Not going to get into that too much right now, but just know that those are typically available if you're age 70 and a half and you have qualified pre-tax retirement funds. And so if you don't fall into that camp, this can be a great alternative and a new way to begin getting some sort of tax benefit for your charitable donations. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act brought about a number of tax changes, and hopefully the ones that we reviewed with you today were helpful, but as you know, tax laws are incredibly complex, and so we would encourage you to review these changes with your tax professional to determine if there's any strategies that could be worth implementing for you. That's all for now. We'll see you next time.